Hello and welcome. Today we are going to be talking about R.A.G. No, that is not that thing that is sitting on your sink when you're washing the dishes. R.A.G. is an acronym that stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation, and it is part of a strategy for LLMs to be able to provide you with augmented content. So given that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our illustrious co-hosts first. We have Bronwen Aker here, wave Bronwen. We have Derek Banks, Brian Fehrman, and Ben Bowman. All right. On that note, I am now going to spin the toothpick, as I like to say, and point it at Brian Fehrman to give us a little bit of a definition and introduction to R.A.G. So R.A.G., talk about that for me, Brian.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the problem that it's trying to solve. So R.A.G. is something that ties into large language models, as I'm sure most of you know, are often seen as the chatbots that we interact with. They come in other forms, but that's the main ones that people are going to see. And one of the problems with LLMs is it's really kind of a snapshot in time of knowledge. So knowledge has gone into these models, they've been trained on it, and they can use that pre-existing knowledge to give us responses when we ask it questions. But there's two problems with that, two big problems with that. One is that it's not including the latest up-to-date knowledge that people might want to know about. And furthermore, it might not be tailored to a specific set of knowledge. So just because it had, a large body of knowledge before doesn't mean that it's got everything in there that people might want. And so that's where R.A.G. comes in. R.A.G. allows LLMs to utilize other sources, whether it be documents or web content or whatever other type of data sources you can feed into this. And then it can leverage those sources when you ask it a question or ask it for information to give you the most up-to-date information or most tailored or in-depth information that you might be looking for at the time.
Gotcha. Okay, so given that, let's say an organization is deploying their own LLM. They've maybe contracted out with OpenAI or one of these other big model providers, and they go to that organization, provider, and they say, look, we've got all these documents that are organizationally relevant. I've heard about this R.A.G. thing. How do I take all those documents and turn them into something that this LLM can actually retrieve? And how does the LLM know the context is correct? I'm going to throw this one to Bronwen. What do you think? What's the take on that, Bronwen?
Well, I mean, are you talking about implementation or just the concept? Because the whole idea is that rather than having everything baked into the LLM model itself, instead you have a repository where you can have documents that are static or even dynamic, because the LLM model is basically going to act as a go-between. So the user says, hey, I want to know about what our acceptable use policy is for our company. And they enter that into the LLM, and then the LLM reaches out to where those documents are stored, and then will formulate something, make it appropriate based on the prompt it's given, and then feed it back to the user through the LLM.
Gotcha.
Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, so conceptually, that makes perfect sense. I'm just wondering, on the panel, I'll just sort of throw this out to everybody. Has anybody actually gone through the process of taking documents or a collection of URLs maybe and try to generate some sort of R.A.G. entity and connect it to an LLM locally? And can you explain a little bit about the mechanics of that?
Yeah, I feel like that that is a perfect question for Brian Fehrman, who wrote a blog on exactly this.
You know what? It sounds like a good question for Mr.
Spelling the
Fehrman.
softball up for you there.
Yeah, I'll take it. So one of the things to keep in mind is that LLMs and really we'll just say computers in general, they don't deal with words, really. They don't deal with text. What they deal with is they deal with numbers. And so kind of one of the first steps that I'll say into one of the first big steps into getting documents into a form that an LLM can interact with is to convert them into numbers. And that's called the embedding process. So basically you're taking this body of text and you are converting it into this this vector of numbers based upon the text that is contained within it. And that is then something that the LLM can actually work with. And so then it goes through that embedding process. It will take that vectors from the information, put it into what's called a vector database. And now when you go to do ask the LLM some question, where you're trying to get it to leverage these documents, it'll then go through the same process of taking your input, go through that same embedding process to convert it to a set of numbers, a vector of numbers, and then it'll perform, now it can start doing cool math operations with it, right? Such as like a cosine similarity measure and other measures to basically see, given your text that's been converted into this vector, find vectors that are similar to this or relevant to it, so that it can then grab them out, do the reverse, convert them back into word form, and then hopefully give you something that's relevant. So that's kind of the high level, low level, at same time overview of what's going on there.
So that makes sense. We're building some sort of, vector-based database entity out of some documents, and the LLM is essentially doing a little bit of math, looking for context and similarity in order to be able to produce a link or produce the information itself. So given that implies that if an organization's doing this locally, then they're going to have a regular pipeline that updates that information to make sure it stays relevant to their day-to-day operations. Okay, all that's awesome.
I have a quick question. So I know that training a new model from the ground up can be fairly intensive. How intensive is training the vector database compared to a brand new model?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So typically you're just going to do the same thing that you do, using like a frontier model. You would use an embedding model that's already pre-trained in most circumstances. In fact, if you look at the available models through, like, say, OpenAI's endpoint, you'll see that they have an embedding model that you can send queries to, right? Or if you're setting this up like with like Open Web UI or something like that, they have in their ability to essentially create a RAG or in their functions in the app, create a RAG implementation, and you can choose your embedding database. And as we found, and Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, it's not as easy as just bolting it together.
No, not at all. Not at all. And I think that pointing out too that there are models specifically trained to do this task is very important, because when I first started playing around with this, I just grabbed I was trying to use the same model for answering my questions and the embedding. And oh my goodness, that worked like absolute garbage.
I was like, this is
coin flip.
It was 25% match. What the heck?
Yeah, it was terrible. It was like, this is all nonsense. And then I realized, oh no, there are models that have specifically been trained to do this embedding task. But even once you have those, I think the community as a whole is finding out that no, it's still not just as easy as just throwing documents at this, embedding them, and hoping that something's going to happen. There's a whole lot more that goes on.
Yeah, a lot of data sciencing that still has to happen.
Yes.
Right. So given that, my gut is that with everything that we've talked about with LLMs, the more functionality that we actually throw onto an application, let's say it's a chatbot application, which is very typical that most organizations are doing internally, the more functionality we throw at these things, the larger the attack surface tends to grow. So can we talk a little bit about what kind of security risks that implementing RAG actually brings forward for an organization? And maybe I'll throw this one over to Ben, if you can have a thought on this. I know Ben's been working on a framework for some attacking, and maybe you have some thoughts there. And if Ben hasn't actually reached the RAG spot, we'll throw it open to the panel. Ben, have you got any thoughts on that?
I mean, my immediate knee-jerk reaction would be, if it's taking any sort of input, of course you can tamper with it, right? So my immediate input would be, if there's a file sitting there that is reading from static or dynamic, it doesn't really matter. I suppose what you could do is just throw any sort of stuff in there and essentially have like an easier data poisoning attack to manipulate what the AI does. It actually sounds like a better data poisoning attack vector to me. Sounds like it's more open season. So I would like to see that in the wild. You guys should go forward with this more. But as a security standpoint, it's probably like you would really want to make sure that whatever you do, you defend your whatever files are being inputted. You'd really want to DMZ those things, because data poisoning would be a lot of fun, especially with like Active Directory stuff, depending on what you feed it,
Right. So, I mean, I think part of that, so part of the implication of implementing RAG for an organization is you're going to end up having to have a pipeline of some sort to regularly update the vectorizing process and the embedding database. And so there's a point of vulnerability there. But the other thing that concerns me is organizations, when they engage upon this, they have a lot of very sensitive data in the various documents they have. So how do they, handle things like, banking credentials and PII and all this sort of stuff? I mean, how do they address that problem and stop those things perhaps from getting into the RAG, or somehow appropriately silo those things? Anybody got thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think the first rule of thumb would be to not put that information in the data store. So you'd have to have some level of sanitization of things going in, like what Ben says. I mean, because you have like three really like risk exposures here. You have sensitive data, data poisoning, and then over-reliance on retrieval, which basically just means, that you're trusting the integrity, kind of like a spin on the data poisoning kind of thing. And so I think, the first part would be to not put the sensitive data in there. But if, that's the function of the LLM and the system, well, that's easier said than done, right? Like, just if we're a law firm and we're making this and we want to put all of our legal documents in there, by definition, is that not sensitive data? So then you get into the world of role-based access control. And that's where the fun begins, I think.
Yeah, so it strikes me that, again, if we go to that typical application of an instructor, a chatbot that might be deployed internally, that role-based access control to those things is rather difficult. And I'm not aware of implementations inside of APIs that are out there right now that try to make that difference, right, between who's accessing the data. And I think furthermore, we have all sat down and attacked LLMs and proved that we can socially engineer them and jailbreak them and do all those things, which I think potentially can bypass any role-based access controls that somebody might implement.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. I think that this is still uncharted territory. We actually have a potential customer asking us to, probably by the time this actually gets released, we'll probably, if they accept, we'll probably already have done the test. But they specifically do have an implementation where they have the same LLM on the back end, the same data store for their data, and they have multiple users accessing data, and they want to keep data separate. And it's going to be interesting to see how they did that, or how they're doing that, how we can test it.
I can't.
Yeah, go ahead, Bronwen.
I can't imagine the difficulty involved, because, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm more used to working with the user implementations. The data itself has to be tokenized. Now, is that same process going into the vector database when in a similar way that it is when we're building a model? Because trying to assign role-based action control to individual tokens. Am I misunderstanding something somewhere?
No. Well, no, I don't think so. I mean, I think the way that, I don't know what their design is, but I mean, you could potentially have different databases per customer or some different instances per customer. I mean, that's, I think, how you'd have to do it, right?
Yeah.
Kind of the same thing. Go ahead, Brian.
Oh, and say, one of the ways and by the way, Brian, you're completely correct. Like at the data level or the model level, it's not really, like, it's tough.
Not possible.
So one of the ways that it can be done, and actually, so if you play around with like Open Web UI, you see it here. And we've seen another company that we did some testing for who did it this way as well, which is you have the concept of what are called assistants. So assistants are you pick a model, and then you can assign specific data to that model, and you can give it a system prompt. You can give it all these specific sets of instructions, and then you decide who has access to that assistant. So it's not the model that's making the decision. It's not necessarily like something right at the data level, but it's basically saying that when you access this assistant, we'll just say entry-level person assistant, this model has access to this data. And so that's one of the ways that people are trying to implement it. And I don't know, we'll kind of see how it goes.
That security layer up to like the API level, right?
Exactly.
The application level. And I think that's where you have to deal with it. And then I mean, as we've seen with just any web app and API, right? Well, it's easy to say that. Sometimes it's not easy to implement that. Right?
Yes, exactly.
All right. So I think we're circling around mitigation strategies here ultimately, right? We've talked about, being very cautious about what gets stored and making sure that an organization has a very strong pipeline in terms of that vectorizing process for the RAG data that's going in, making sure that they scrub it for API tokens and credentials and PII and all the things that we would be significantly concerned about as security professionals. We've talked about role-based access control and how that's very, very difficult in the context of LLMs generally. The other part of this discussion that always has bothered me is what I call the video camera, and that is logging and monitoring and auditing side of this, because when something goes wrong, it's not going to be an if. We need a way to to forensically kind of work out what happened.
I was going to say, well, Joff, you sound like you're talking about incident response.
Exactly. We're talking about incident response as it pertains to models that we've deployed locally or even public models. And so
it's kind of
I've not seen anything on that, Derek or Brian or Ben. Anybody thoughts on that?
I've certainly seen customers logging, in a more generic sense, logging, web requests on their application server, and that has to happen. So, I mean, I would say that you'd want to log all of the input and output, but that said, I think you'd also want to try and put a canary in of some sort for data poisoning, or perhaps in all your documents maintain like a metadata kind of tag, and if you don't see that tag in the data, then something has happened, kind of like an integrity check or something, to be proactive. I mean, there's a lot to be concerned about, I think.
So I think there's a lot that's not done yet. Is what's happening right now. Again, this is part of a hype cycle of AI and LLMs where we're rushing to implement, and we're not really thinking about the security concerns as much as we should be.
You mean like when we did mobile devices years and years ago?
Yeah. I know I've seen multiple organizations talk about the need for auditing, but I haven't seen anything that is concrete about how to actually do that. So the guidance people are thinking ahead to, we need to have these auditing controls. We need to have alerting, but I'm not seeing anything on the mechanics or not in the resources that I have feeding me information about AI on a regular basis.
Right.
I read a paper I really liked recently, and it basically was suggesting that the document for RAG be encrypted with like RSA or some type of encryption similar to where the AI had a key trained into it that it was meant to protect, and then when it would access the document, it would actually decrypt the document on the fly, process it, and then if people get access to the document, they would have to have that key, which AI would hopefully defend, but defending that key is another issue.
What could possibly go wrong?
Right, and then we're back to social engineering and jailbreaking and all those things, because we can.
I'd rather have the key static in a file somewhere, and then have specific access to it and give it to the LLM. That sounds terrible.
So here's another question. The thought I had is, with RAG implementations and LLMs kind of coming together, has anybody seen any attempts at some sort of guardrail that's kind of in the middle between the LLM and the actual retrieval augmented generation? Is there something there that can act as a filter of sorts before the organizational information is just given back to the LLM?
I think your normal guardrail would apply here, right? Like if you put guardrails like Meta's or NVIDIA's in front of But I think that that's now in front of the embedding call. And so it would still make a determination on whether it thought it was a malicious prompt or not. Because I still think that, to take advantage of getting sensitive information out, you're going down the prompt injection and jailbreaking road.
Well, I'm actually kind of thinking on the other side, the output encoding kind of side.
Oh, yeah.
When the data is coming back that's been retrieved, if there's anything that to be implemented that may be almost like a DLP that's looking for sensitive data before it presents it back to the model.
Yeah, there definitely are other LLMs probably watching for terms like PII and social security number or whatever other HIPAA like things. If you give it like the big long list of what is it, the IDT 10 codes or something like that we used to use, and C2 tests. Do you remember that? I mean, you could even need AI to do it. You could just do like filter like word checks.
And so like you mentioned NVIDIA's guardrails, NEMO, so they've got input and output filtering you can put into place. And it's kind of cool because you can actually layer. So you can put in basically as many different checks with as many different models as you want on both the input and the output side. But those things are great to do, great to put in. People should definitely have them, but just people also need to be aware it's not bulletproof, right? Because you can start playing games with the LLM of saying like, okay, yeah, give me the output when you grab it. Make sure to base64 encode it, and depending on where that encoding actually happens, you might be able to bypass some of these filters that are looking for. Like if you play like the Gandalf challenges off Lakera, for instance, that's no spoilers, but that's
exactly what I was thinking, right? It was like, it sounds like level 5 of the Gandalf challenge or something.
Yeah. So there's another concept that's floating around. I don't want to go off into a tangent, but I just want to touch on it from a security perspective. We've talked about before the idea of fine-tuning models to sort of enculturate them and lean them towards having a specific task or domain of knowledge focus. From a security perspective, am I going to be better off if I just go down the fine-tuning route and just push this RAG stuff to one side? Or am I missing something here?
I can see some benefit, but I mean, fine-tuning isn't necessarily going to protect you against social engineering, or if you're not sanitizing the input. I mean, you still need to sanitize input regardless. You still need to do all of the normal things to control the usual suspects. I can't see fine-tuning addressing those.
Yeah,
right.
I've kind of thought of fine-tuning as more along the lines of, I mean, more information can be introduced, but usually the way that I understand it now, and my understanding is ever evolving, it seems, it's a way to influence the behavior, or to change the behavior of a model, right? More so than it is to give the model more information.
Yeah.
And so they're kind of, I mean, there might be some overlap between RAG and supervised fine-tuning, but at least that's my take on it at the moment.
Yeah. So, supervised fine-tuning, I've done quite a lot of, and, some of the upsides are it does tend to give you a more optimal enculturated model towards the knowledge domain that you're after, which has the advantage of saving some token effort on the prompting side, which is nice, but it's complementary to RAG. And my gut instinct is basically the same security risks exist regardless of whether we fine-tune the model and then apply RAG, or whether we just use a base model and apply RAG. So that's kind of interesting. All right. So I guess last few topics here in terms of Q&A, open discussion here. I guess the open question for me is, does RAG actually introduce more security risks? And is that worse for us if we balance that against the operational gains that we have with RAG? And are we aware of any lessons learned of our customers that we're dealing with, or any of our implementations with regard to implementing RAG?
Is that for the group?
That's for the group. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that just in general, anytime you bolt additional functionality onto anything, that being an LLM or a web server or whatever, I think you increase the complexity and increase the attack surface, right? And so is the risk, outweigh the benefit? Probably not for most folks if you're doing it correctly. I mean, I think that I wouldn't say that RAG is so inherently risky, I would never use it.
Yeah. That's my gut feeling as well. Any other final thoughts? I'll throw this Ben's direction again. In terms of, Ben, you've been developing some stuff in terms of framework for attacking and some methodology around a workshop for attacking. Has any of this discussion, does it influence or change your thoughts on that development?
Not really. It seems like the general rule of thumb in security in general is more feature, more attack surface, input, output, you can tamper with it. I mean, no matter how many bells and whistles they add, it's always going to be the same methodology to approach. So I don't think it changes a lot from an attacker perspective, but it does make me excited to think that there might be a low-hanging fruit coming my way. Other than that, I don't think it's super crazy. I'm actually, now that I'm looking at this, I kind of wonder if this isn't worth putting in my class as like a lab. So yeah, no, it's great. I like it.
Well, I think that kind of answers the question, right? Because it's increasing the attack surface, then it's a potential lab for your workshop, which means it's potential fodder for attack, for sure. Well, that's awesome. Well, look, we're about 20 minutes in, folks. I think we'll wrap it up. Any final thoughts from Bronwen or Brian, Derek, Ben, before we wrap the show up?
Keep your rags clean.
Mm-hmm. Keep your rags clean.
And remember, it's just like Scotty said, the more complicated they make things, the easier it is to clog up the system.
No doubt. Complexity is the enemy of good security. And with that, folks, I'm going to say keep on prompting, and thanks for watching on Retrieval Augmented Generation.